Hi everyone. In this video, we're going to introduce the concept of taxation and then do an example where we put a tax on a producer. So first, to start off, what are taxes? Taxes are when the government collects fees or money from people, usually in conjunction with some objective, often in this case the production or sale of a good or service. So why do governments tax? Well, you might be able to come up with a fair number of reasons. I think the two main reasons are, one, to raise revenue. Right? If the government is going to provide public goods or provide services to people, then they need resources to do that. They have to raise that revenue. Somehow, taxation is the main way for governments to raise revenue. In some cases, though, we also use taxes in an effort to modify behavior. So sometimes the government may tax something in order to discourage its use. So the so-called sin tax, right? If you tax cigarettes or you have taxed alcohol. In some cases, you might tax something because of an externality, and we're going to talk about that down the road. But if burning fossil fuels has negative effects on the environment that affect people at large, society at large, then maybe you need to price some of that in. So the carbon tax is one example of how people do that. So those are the two main reasons. For our purposes, we don't need to worry too much about it now, but I like to highlight those or indicate those now, because once we get to some chapters down the road, we'll see how in different cases these taxes will work better or not so good to further those particular goals. So now, next up we need to talk about tax incidents. And we're going to talk about two kinds of incidents. Legal incidents. And legal incidents is the party who pays the tax up front, or let's say the party on whom, grammatically correct, the tax is levied. Who do you charge the tax to? They bear the legal incidents. So we're going to look at two different examples. We'll look at when you put the tax on the producer, say for example, or when you put the tax on the consumer. And you can control the legal incidents by by how you write the tax bill, by who you put the tax on. But the thing you can't control by how you write the tax bill is the economic incidents. The economic incidents refers to the party who bears the burden of the tax. The party who bears the burden of the tax. We're going to see that's the party who loses surplus to pay the tax. So you could say who loses surplus, producer surplus, to pay the tax. It says surplus, I'm not quite sure. Not that much better. But that's the economic incidents. So tuck that definition away as well. So now let's do an example where we put a tax on the producer. So we'll do an example of a tax on a producer. Now we have a whole separate video where I put a tax on a consumer. We go through this and we'll see that the end result is actually very similar, but the way it starts out is very different. So let's look at the market for a particular good. Let's look at the Xbox. So let's say you're looking at gaming systems. You're looking at the market for the Xbox. You have the price, the quantity. There's some downward sloping demand for Xboxes. There's an upward sloping supply curve. That gives you a market equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Now we can highlight a couple areas here. Right? We know that everything, whoops, let's see, thought I was highlighting. We know that everything below the demand curve and down to the price that you actually have to pay, right? This represents consumer surplus, right? Gains to consumers. Oh, it gets prettier after you make multiple pictures. There we go. So you have an area of consumer surplus, and then you have, gains to the producer, right? Because there's an area here where, I need this, I'll make this pink. The difference between what producers would be willing to accept and what they actually accept, that gives you producer surplus. So that's your starting point, right? And the market is efficient and you maximize the area of economic surplus. Now, suppose that we impose a tax on the Xbox producer. So, and let's add in here, let's call this equilibrium price $300, right? Now, suppose either because we need to raise revenue to fund government activities, or because we think people play too many video games and we want to make them more expensive so they don't, fritter away as much time, let's say. For either of those reasons, let's impose a tax of, let's say, $25 on producers or sellers of Xboxes. So that will basically, you could think of this as an increase in their costs, right? Because now every time they make and sell an Xbox, they still have all the raw materials, they still have all the labor, they still have all the overhead, they have all of the costs that they had before, the marketing, the distribution. And now on top of that, they have to pay a $25 tax. So you can think about this as an increase in their costs. So we know from thinking about factors that shift the supply curve, an increase in the cost of production will shift the supply curve to the left. And now I can tell you it will shift it such that the vertical distance right here is $25. Right? Price, the taxes are measured with dollars. It's a price measurement. So you have to measure it straight up and down, because prices are measured vertically, right, on the vertical axis. Quantity is measured horizontal. Don't get sloppy and say, all right, the distance between the supply curve, original and the second supply curve, is $25. Because that doesn't make sense. If you're moving in a diagonal direction, you're moving in price and quantity. I don't even know what that means. So don't get sloppy when you label it. You want to identify the price straight up and down. And so with these higher costs, there's now a new equilibrium, and producers make fewer Xboxes, and they ultimately sell them at a higher price. So the price the consumer pays is higher than it was before. It's higher than PE. Now, does that make the producers better off? Well, not really, right? They get to collect PE, or PC, I'm sorry, they collect the higher price. But then this vertical distance right here, this represents $25, right? This is the size of the tax. So that much they have to pay out in tax. And so what's left for the producer to keep to cover the raw materials, the labor, the overhead, all of those other costs is down here. So we'll label this P sub P, right? The price the producer gets to keep. So compared to the initial equilibrium of P of E, the consumer pays more and the producer gets less. So there are a couple things going on here. The consumer is paying a price that's higher than they used to have to pay, but the producer is keeping less money after paying the tax than they did before. And where does that money go? Well, let's highlight that area. That goes to the government, right? That's tax revenue. If after the tax they sell Q2 units, then the tax is collected on this many units, right? That's Q2. And the tax is $25 each. So on the first unit, they collect $25. On the second unit, the government collects $25. On the third, fourth, fifth, right? All the way across here up to the Q2, the last unit. And so this rectangle right here represents tax revenue. Right, that box with the green stripes represents tax revenue. So now we can think about incidence. Who bears the legal incidence of the tax? Well, the legal incidence, right, that's the party who pays the tax up front, and we levied the tax on the producers or the sellers. So the legal incidence, and I'll just make a note here. The legal incidence is on the producers because that's who we charge the tax to. Does that mean that producers eat the full effect of the tax? Well, no. Right? They eat some of it because producers, we can see, get to keep a price that's lower than they used to. So producers are made worse off. But what about the consumers? Well, consumers will have to pay a price that was higher than they did before. So it turns out that the parties that are affected by the tax are actually both of them. And so when we think about the economic incidence, who bears the burden of the tax, we see that some of the tax revenue is carved out of what was an orange area of consumer surplus, and part of the tax revenue is carved out of the pink area, which was producer surplus. So it's actually, the economic incidence is actually shared by consumers and producers. So the economic incidence falls on both. And you can see that two ways. One, when you look at the green rectangle or the rectangle with the green stripes, you can see that where did it come from? Both consumers lost surplus and producers lost surplus. So they both bear some of the economic incidence. You can also see it because consumers pay a higher price than they did before, and producers get a lower price than they did before. Now, just as an aside, I don't know exactly what PC is in terms of dollars, but here's a tip. This is an error some people make. Some people get excited and they'll label this PC $3.25 because they know that the tax was $25 and they'll just add that on here. But remember, this distance from the original E2, from E2 down to the blue line below it, this whole distance is $25. So a part of that distance cannot be $25. It has to be less than that. So P sub C is some number less than 325. It's more than 300, it's less than 325. Looking at my graph, it looks like it's roughly equal, or maybe there's a tad more coming from the orange, like it's a little bit more in the orange than the red, than the pink. So I don't know. Maybe it's 312, maybe it's 315, maybe it's 310. I don't know. But you don't even have to put a specific number on it. Just understand that if you write 325, that's wrong, right? P sub C cannot be 325 because $25 is this whole distance from this line, from PC all the way down to PP. So I'm going to erase that, right? Don't label that don't label that the original equilibrium plus the whole tax. Why? Because the economic incidence says that it's shared by both producers and consumers. Now, there's one last thing to point out here. Consumers lost some surplus, right? Consumers now have to pay this higher price. So the area of consumer surplus is smaller, and a big chunk of that goes to the government in the form of tax revenue. But there's this chunk out here. What happens there? That's consumer surplus when you're at E, right at the original equilibrium, that is no longer consumer surplus, but is also not tax revenue. And the same with this producer surplus down here. This represents producer surplus if you're in equilibrium at point E, right at the starting point. But once you impose the tax and shift the supply curve and get to E2, this is no longer surplus. But it's not transferred, right? It's not a transfer from one party to the other, that is from consumers to the government or producers to the government. This just goes away. And so what do we call it whenever we have surplus that just disappears? That's a deadweight loss. Or more specifically, you could call it the deadweight loss of taxation. But if you write deadweight loss, that's more than sufficient. And that's a problem, right? That's a loss of efficiency. We impose a tax, we distort the market, and we see that there's no longer as much surplus as there used to be. So that's your graph for a tax on the producer. There's a separate video for the tax on the consumer. and we'll see how in both cases you get ultimately a similar result. So follow up if you have questions. Take care. Talk to you later.